Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Brian Loew, Chief Executive Officer at Inspire. Brian created Inspire in 2005 with the goal of accelerating clinical trial recruitment through the use of safe, trusted online social networks organized by medical condition for patients and their caregivers. He has been an internet entrepreneur since 1994. His content management software company created and launched over 100 websites for major publishers. And he was also responsible for technology strategy at the Washington Post. You can find Inspire on Twitter at Team Inspire, and you can find Brian at Brian Loew. That's Loew. Welcome, Brian, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to join you.
So for starters, what is the value proposition of your hosted communities? Let's talk about patients first, and then I'd like to hear about your other constituencies as well.
Sure. Our goal at Inspire is to accelerate medical progress through a world of connected patients. The idea is that members join Inspire typically as patients or caregivers, and they are in a space that is safe and protected, in which they are in control, along with others who share the same or similar medical conditions. We span the breadth of human health, so 3,100 rare diseases as well as all of the common diseases. And members self-organize in sub-communities so that they can share notes and collaborate around their specific medical issues. It's also true that many of our members have multiple medical issues, both for themselves and also potentially as caregivers. And it's a safe space for them to get involved in everything about health in their life.
You mentioned the notion of having communities that are dedicated to rare conditions. I'm wondering how granular that group identity can be. Is it completely determined by members who may set something up?
We curate the list of groups. So today, about 1/3 of our population is in oncology, so cancer patients and caregivers. 1/4 have rare disorders, and then the rest are in all other areas, including rather large populations with symptomatic chronic conditions like psoriasis, for example. But there are subgroups within those larger groups. And so, for example, and a lot of this is built on what we learned from our members. So, for example, in our lung cancer community, we have sub-discussion areas for each of the stages of lung cancer. And this idea came from our members, who told us that some members said, that they were earlier stage and weren't quite ready for later stage discussions, and they wanted those groups to be segmented out. Another example is our infertility communities are divided into two communities. One, couples who are trying to get pregnant, and another is people who are trying to stay pregnant. And it turns out that was very good advice that we got from our partner, the National Infertility Association, about organizing groups that way. We've learned that every medical condition is a little bit different, and it's something that needs to evolve over time.
So patients are a big constituency, and I'm interested in sort of who are your other constituencies.
Right. Patients and also caregivers. Caregivers are a very large constituency in Inspire. For example, our prostate cancer community is 50% female. Those women are typically either spouses or daughters-in-law, men with prostate cancer. And we see this caregiver presence across all medical conditions. And one of the things I've come to realize over the life of Inspire is that we feel that there's an enormous, this will sound obvious, but there's such enormous needs that caregivers have, and oftentimes caregivers are underappreciated and undersupported. We could do a lot to support caregivers more as a society. Another constituency is medical professionals. That constitutes about 9 or 10% of Inspire. And then finally, there are two others. One is our patient advocacy partners. So Inspire partners with 110 national patient advocacy organizations, groups like the American Lung Association and the National Osteoporosis Foundation and the National Psoriasis Foundation, as well as many rare disease groups like the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance or the Wilson's Disease Association. And these patient advocacy partners are extraordinary organizations that are that bring a lot of credibility, authority, and trust to the communities. And then the final constituent is researchers. And so the reason, the way that Inspire pays the bills is through revenue from research, and that's from industry trying to advance medical progress. And our goal ultimately is to facilitate medical progress by enabling researchers around the world. While we do some research ourselves, our real goal is to make it possible for thousands of researchers outside of Inspire to do great work more quickly.
A key issue at any time, and particularly in recent times, a key issue for patients and for any website hosting communities of patients is privacy, and how
Right.
patient privacy is protected so that discussions can serve the community participants' needs.
Right.
How have you seen patient awareness, community member awareness about privacy issues evolve over time? And what is your perspective on this critical issue?
This is the most important ethical issue for Inspire and perhaps for healthcare, at least in America today. What we have found is that what all of us really want is not to lock up our information forever, but rather to be in control of it. So you and I, as patients and as people with health information, need to be in control of who has access to our information, and we need to be the one to grant that access and to decide when and to be able to read. And given that many join Inspire at some of the sort of most life, it's especially important that we treat them with profound respect. And so in Inspire, what we tell members is that you can choose to share or not share. Here's a control panel where you can decide what you want to share and what you don't. And then choose the default settings to be, if no one ever touched the settings, we still would still be ethical and appropriate. And our gut check is to ask ourselves, would I be happy if someone close to me, a family member perhaps, were treated in this way? One of the other things I'll say about privacy and control is that trust evolves over time. It's not a good idea, I think, for sites like ours or communities like ours to expect complete trust on day zero. Instead, it should be fine for someone to be able to join and then over time decide who to trust and how that evolves. In Inspire, you can set your privacy settings to be public or members only or friends only. So you can, if you want, create a small friend group and share information only with those members. And the key point around this privacy and control when we engage with researchers is that everything we do is permission based. So there are a number of things we never do, like sell lists of names. What we instead do is send an invitation to a member, asking that member if he or she would like to participate in research. And if the answer is no, or if the invitation is ignored, then no means no. But if the member actively wants to participate, we then sort of make a connection and step away. It took some time to really deeply understand this, and I will say that the position we have now is based on lots and lots of feedback from members over the last 14 years. And I think that trust is everything, and it's really important to engender trust in our members and to maintain it.
Absolutely. If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on HealthcareNOW Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Brian Loew, CEO of Inspire, online at inspire.com. Brian, the patient perspective is increasingly recognized as being critical to medical research.
Right.
How have you seen the regulatory landscape evolve, and how have you seen the patient conversation evolve, either alongside that regulatory evolution or maybe just a little ahead of it?
There's so much going on, which is great to see. The FDA now is developed patient-focused drug development guidelines, which is wonderful. The idea that patient perspectives really matter, that's something we're heartened to see. We have done work with both the NIH and the FDA. In one example, in some collaboration with the FDA, we worked to better understand the life experiences of patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension. And it was good for us to see that what the FDA was interested in was, the lived experiences of patients and caregivers around this condition, and to treat that as a source as valid as, scientific or medical, physician information. So that's on the government side. There are other really interesting examples of things that become possible with large numbers. So in one case, we did some work recently that was published in JAMA Oncology. It was a collaboration with Stanford Bioinformatics, where we looked at members taking immuno-oncology drugs, and we found a previously unreported adverse event for one immuno-oncology drug, and we also found adverse drug results for reactions for a number of for two other drugs, an average of 7 months ahead of when they were reported through the FAERS, the Adverse Event Drug Reporting System. So what we found here was when we look back at the 1.5 billion words that have been written by Inspire members, and we looked at, in this case, 8 million discussions around these specific diseases and treatments, what we found was that patients were talking about side effects they had, 6, 7, 8 months ahead of when those side effects were ultimately reported. And so one of the conclusions that I think was evident in the JAMA paper with Stanford was that we should not ignore these kinds of data, because they can be profoundly useful in being sort of early warnings about things which can then be scientifically validated later on.
So this is a real jump from the sort of classic gold standard randomized controlled trial, and
right.
The issues are legion in terms of collecting and coding and analyzing the kind of data that you're talking about.
Right.
Do you see this now as gaining greater acceptance in the academic community and the medical community?
Yes and no. I've come to believe that patient perspectives, including patient-reported outcome measures, are as important as clinical data. But by that, I don't mean to suggest that these patient perspectives should replace randomized clinical trials. Instead, that they should point us in directions for research. I'll give you an example. There was a project we did with Mayo Clinic several years ago, where 70 women in Inspire with spontaneous coronary artery dissection brought themselves to a researcher at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Sharon Hayes, and presented themselves to be studied. And Dr. Hayes, for her entire career, had been trying to study this condition, and the largest study that had ever been done was with 18 patients. And here were 70 women from our women heart community presenting themselves to be studied. And Dr. Hayes was rightfully thrilled, and she then this led her to conduct research with this, and we now have a population of over 500 women who have had this spontaneous coronary artery dissection. The point here is not that these women were replacing the role of the scientist, but rather that they were enabling scientists to do work, fulsomely and quickly. And that's where the value is. And I feel like sometimes we find public debate is asking, I think, a false dichotomy, asking whether these patient-reported measures are a substitute for clinical data, and that's not the goal we're trying to advance at all. We're just saying that they are crucially important.
Right. So it's not just a question of what some might call qualitative research versus quantitative research.
Right.
It's a question of filtering some of that qualitative data and identifying populations that can be enrolled in quantitative research and follow-up and so forth as well.
That's right. It's saying that
are there other examples? Because the SCAD example is something that I've heard over and over again.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm hoping there are other examples as well.
There are others as well. There's I'll give you one which is a kind of a one of the things we've run into over time is we'll talk with a researcher. I'll give you two examples that we're working on right now. One is with a very large national hospital system, and the other is with a very large pharmaceutical company. And these are going on right now. The first one is at this a cardiologist who had a hunch, and he's been practicing for 30 years. He had a hunch that there's a correlation between a certain class of drugs and a certain symptom that was unrelated previously thought, and it was just a hunch, and he didn't have enough data to make a strong case for it. But we used natural language processing and machine learning to look at the words written by our members with that condition, and found a very strong correlation between those two things, which was previously sort of undiscovered. So this is now leading this physician to explore this further and to probably publish a paper about it. And it's the kind of signal that only shows up when you have very large, population sizes. Another example, the one with a pharmaceutical company researcher, is looking at correlation between a certain type of cancer and certain, without going into too much detail, certain childhood events. And this is, again, something that was based on theory and ideas, but again, because of the rarity of the conditions here, there just weren't large enough sample sizes available. And in this case, we've actually found several dozen patients who have this extraordinarily rare sort of coincidence of conditions, and this is going to enable genetic research around this. I'm thrilled to see that kind of thing, because what it says is that there is trapped value in the engagement of these members in the community. And I'll just add that the participation of all the patients in this is voluntary. And when we invite patients to participate, the reaction is typically one of delight to be able to advance the research. And so this idea that the idea is that really everyone can benefit. There are not winners and losers here. It's really about everyone benefiting from the medical progress.
Brian, some patient advocates are advocating that patients be compensated for the use of their data
Right.
in pharma research, et cetera.
Right.
Is that something that is either built into your platform or on the horizon?
We compensate members for engaging in some of the research that we do. Where we're allowed. We provide honoraria. So in general, I'm absolutely in favor of this. I don't think there's yet there are some companies now that are looking at whether there's a way to do this on a kind of, there's some other interesting companies you've heard of that are using sort of blockchain, companies like Humanity and Luna and others that are looking at ways of compensating patients, ideally with the idea that over the very long term, people could sell access to information about themselves. And conceptually, I'm absolutely in favor of that. It still seems to me that it's early. What I'm opposed to is when members' data are misused. Things like the Memorial Sloan Kettering example recently, where to someone's surprise, their data are used in ways or monetized in ways that they didn't sign up for. I think that's where I think there's a problem.
Right. This ties into a broad issue that has been related not only to data issues, but to tissue sample uses. I mean, this goes back to Henrietta Lacks.
Right.
This goes
Right.
back to the California case of decades ago, and many other issues. And I think the question now is if I consent to the use of my data or the use of my cells or whatever else, what is the context for my consent?
Right.
The context may change over time, or my understanding what's possible as a result of this consent may change over time.
Right.
And a lot of us are wrestling with the idea of how to capture context of consent, and maybe how to think about being able to extend consent as context and meaning of consent may change over time. Is that something that you've been thinking about as well? Do you have any insights on that front that can inform this conversation?
It concerns me a lot, but I'm heartened a little bit by, I guess, what I've seen as maybe a change in attitude over the life, the short life of our company, that over the past dozen years or so, the fraction of researchers who take the kind of "don't worry your pretty little head" attitude, that's sometimes patronizing or dismissive of patients, that seems to be decreasing. That there are many more researchers and doctors now who understand that it's the property of the patient and it needs to be controlled and determined by the patient. So thank goodness that's improving. You still have, kind of perverse situations. You're probably familiar with the very public patient advocate Hugo Campos, who wears a defibrillator and
Right.
is still fighting to access the data from his own defibrillator. And in this case, I'm only sharing this because it's a story that he tells again and again, and it's a remarkable story. But this is a case where he's wearing a device capturing data, and he's not allowed, formally to access his own data.
Right.
These have to change. These attitudes have to change.
Yes, I would agree. And hopefully we're on the pathway to seeing some change
It feels like we
happening
are.
in the future. I mean,
Yeah.
there's certainly a national dialogue about privacy happening
Right.
now,
Right.
but I think that we can't hold our breath and wait for a legislative solution from Washington at this point.
Agreed.
So you've talked a bit about the value of large numbers of patients in being able to discover some valuable signal,
Right.
so to speak. And yet we're talking in some of those cases about rare disease. Do
Hmm.
you have a sense of what the community size needs to be in order to yield some valuable data?
In some cases, like that example with SCAD, which we've talked about, fairly low, right? So in that case, 70 women was a meaningful number. In other cases, like like that cancer coincidence I talked about, we looked at a very large population, a couple 100,000 cancer patients in order to find a few dozen who had this coincidence of data. And
Is that
so,
across multiple communities?
correct. So that was across 3 different cancers, I believe. And so, I guess the answer is that it varies. More is always better, but sometimes you can find meaningful signal from very small numbers of people. It does mean that using big data approaches and machine learning approaches, we can find patterns and correlations, and that in very large data sets that was difficult to do 10 years ago.
Right, and that's encouraging. Certainly in
Right.
the examples of the rare conditions that you mentioned,
Right.
there's some opportunity for some insight where previously that wasn't available to us.
Right.
Brian, to wrap things up here, I want to ask you if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what is one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect to find has changed drastically?
I guess I would hope that all of us as patients and caregivers, which every single one of us is, even if we're perfectly healthy today, will be at some point in our life, are treated with respect, and our data are available to us without restriction, and we are fully recognized as valuable contributors to medical progress.
That is a positive vision of the future, and I hope we get there sooner rather than later.
Me too.
Thanks for joining me, Brian.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at HealthcareNOWradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at hashtag Harlow on HC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.